October 1945, Camp Hood, Texas. The afternoon sun beat down on the dusty compound where 217 Japanese servicemen stood in formation, their uniforms still bearing the salt stains from 3 weeks aboard a transport ship. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, formerly of the Imperial Navy, watched a military truck roll past the wire fence, and what he saw in the bed of that vehicle would shatter everything he thought he knew about his enemy. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men would discover in the coming months would not be revealed through interrogation or propaganda, but through something as simple as observing what American soldiers casually tossed into metal bowls for their dogs to eat. Yamamoto had been trained at the Etajima Naval Academy, where cadets learned that sacrifice defined a warrior's character. Rice portions had been cut 3 times during his final year. The instructors explained that enduring hunger built spiritual strength. By 1944, when Yamamoto commanded a submarine depot in the South Pacific, his men received 800 grams of rice daily when supplies arrived, which happened less and less frequently. They supplemented their diet with whatever fish they could catch and whatever greens grew near the shore. The naval doctrine emphasized that material comfort weakened a soldier's resolve. Yamamoto believed this completely. The transport from Manila to San Francisco had been uncomfortable but not cruel. The American guards maintained professional distance. They provided meals twice daily, simple but more substantial than what Yamamoto had eaten in the final year of conflict. Still, he attributed this to temporary circumstances. Once they reached the internment facility, he assumed conditions would mirror what he knew from military life: austerity, discipline, rationed supplies. Camp Hood sprawled across 108,000 hectares of central Texas grassland. The facility held servicemen from numerous countries, separated into compounds based on nationality and rank. The Japanese section occupied the northeastern quadrant, 12 barracks arranged around a central yard. Chain-link fencing topped with wire defined the perimeter, guard towers positioned at regular intervals. Beyond the fence, Yamamoto could see other parts of the massive installation: vehicle depots, training grounds, administrative buildings stretching toward the horizon. The first evening, a sergeant named Miller conducted orientation. He spoke slowly, clearly, occasionally consulting a phrasebook for specific terms. The rules were straightforward: morning formation at 6, work assignments after breakfast, lunch at noon, dinner at 5, lights out at 9, cooperation earned privileges, recreation time, access to a small library, occasional film screenings. Resistance meant isolation cells, nothing more. Miller emphasized this final point with unexpected gentleness. "This is not like other places you might have heard about," he said. "We follow the agreements about treatment." Yamamoto found this puzzling. Why mention agreements at all? Warriors understood power. The defeated accepted whatever the victors imposed. Yet Miller seemed concerned that they understand their situation contained defined limits, protections even. The first meals reinforced Yamamoto's confusion. Breakfast included eggs, bread, butter, and coffee. Not substitute coffee made from roasted grain, but actual coffee beans, the aroma unmistakable. Lunch brought thick stew with visible chunks of beef, carrots, potatoes. Dinner offered fried chicken, green beans, more bread. The portions exceeded what Yamamoto's men had received even before supply lines collapsed. That first week, Yamamoto assumed this abundance was temporary, perhaps designed to soften them for interrogation. But the meals continued. Every day, 3 times daily, more food than he had seen in 2 years. He noticed his fellow internees responding with similar disbelief. Ensign Hiroshi Tanaka, who had served aboard a destroyer until fuel shortages left the vessel stranded in Yokosuka harbor, kept touching his stomach after meals, as if verifying its fullness was real. The real revelation began during their second week, when work assignments started. Yamamoto's group was designated for ground maintenance, mowing grass, trimming hedges, general landscaping around the administrative buildings. The assignment seemed almost insulting in its simplicity after his naval career, but he accepted it without comment. Compliance, he had decided, served everyone's interests until circumstances changed. The work detail brought Yamamoto's group into proximity, with American soldiers going about their daily routines. The Americans largely ignored the work crews, occasionally offering a nod or brief greeting, but maintaining professional separation. This indifference was itself strange. Where was the contempt, the hostility? These men had been enemies mere weeks ago. It was during the third day of groundwork that Yamamoto witnessed something that would occupy his thoughts for months afterward. The work crew was trimming hedges near a barracks when a soldier emerged carrying 2 metal bowls. He walked to a shaded area where 2 dogs lay sleeping, both some kind of mixed breed with brown and white markings. The soldier set down the bowls. One contained water. The other contained food. Yamamoto had glanced at the scene casually, then stopped mid-motion with the hedge trimmer. He stared at the bowl of food. The dog approached it, tail wagging, and began eating. Yamamoto moved closer, pretending to work on a nearby shrub. He needed to see clearly, he needed to be certain. The bowl contained meat, substantial chunks of what looked like beef. Mixed with it were bits of vegetables and what might have been rice or grain, but the meat dominated. Real meat, not scraps or gristle, but actual flesh with marbling visible even from several meters away. Yamamoto's hands trembled slightly as he returned to his work. He said nothing to his companions. That evening at dinner he barely tasted his food, his mind replaying what he had seen. The implications were staggering, but he needed more evidence. One observation could be an anomaly. Over the following weeks, Yamamoto paid careful attention whenever dogs appeared on the base. Texas in October was still warm, and many soldiers kept dogs as unofficial companions. The animals wandered freely, sleeping in shade, playing in open areas, and when feeding time came, Yamamoto watched. Every single time the pattern repeated. Bowls filled with meat, vegetables, grain. Proportions varied, but the core remained constant. These animals received more protein than Yamamoto's entire submarine crew had seen in the final 6 months of operations. The dogs ate better than officers had eaten, better than the commanders, better than the admiral himself, most likely. Ensign Tanaka noticed Yamamoto's observations. One evening during recreation period, walking the interior perimeter of their compound, Tanaka spoke quietly in Japanese, knowing the guards could not understand. "You have been watching the dogs," he said. It was not a question. Yamamoto nodded. "Tell me what you see when you look at them." Tanaka was quiet for several paces. "I see animals fed as if they were valued family members. I see meat given away casually, without concern for cost or scarcity. I see abundance so complete that even creatures with no productive purpose receive more than we gave our best men." Yamamoto appreciated Tanaka's directness. The younger officer had a sharp, analytical mind. "What does this tell you about our former enemy?" Yamamoto asked. Tanaka considered carefully. "Either we were catastrophically deceived about America's actual resources, or we fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their society. Perhaps both." They walked in silence. Around them, other internees played chess, read books, talked in small groups. The library had been expanded that week, stocked with Japanese literature and technical manuals. Someone had requested agricultural textbooks, and 3 days later they appeared. Who could access books that quickly? What kind of system enabled such casual fulfillment of requests? The winter months brought more revelations. In December, Camp Hood held a celebration for something called Christmas. The internees were not required to participate, but they were not excluded either. The mess hall was decorated with colored paper and ribbons. The dinner that evening included turkey, a bird Yamamoto had never tasted, along with bread stuffing, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, and 3 kinds of pie for dessert. Captain James Howard, one of the senior American officers, visited the Japanese section that evening. He spoke through an interpreter, a private who had studied in Tokyo before everything fell apart. Howard wanted to ensure they had received adequate portions, that the preparation met with approval. He seemed genuinely concerned, as if hosting guests rather than guarding defeated enemies. Yamamoto, as the senior-ranking Japanese officer, responded with formal politeness. "The meal was generous beyond expectation," he said. "We are grateful for the consideration shown." Howard smiled slightly. "This is simply how we mark the season," he replied through the interpreter. "Our people believe in treating others as we ourselves would wish to be treated, especially during this time of year. You are not our enemies any longer. The conflict has ended. You are simply men far from home, and that is difficult enough without adding unnecessary hardship." After Howard departed, Yamamoto sat alone in the barracks, contemplating those words. Treating others as we ourselves would wish to be treated. The concept was not foreign to Japanese thought, but its application here seemed radically different. In the military culture Yamamoto had known, comfort was suspect, suffering built character, and excess indicated weakness. Yet these Americans fed even their dogs with casual abundance, decorated halls for celebrations, concerned themselves with whether enemy officers enjoyed their turkey. January brought new work assignments. Yamamoto's detail was transferred to the vehicle maintenance depot. The work was more technical, more interesting. They cleaned equipment, organized parts, assisted the American mechanics with basic tasks. This placed them in direct contact with soldiers and gave Yamamoto unprecedented opportunities to observe American military operations up close. The scale of material was breathtaking. Rows of trucks, each one functional, fueled, maintained. Spare parts stored in quantities that seemed excessive, until Yamamoto realized this was standard procedure. When something broke, you replaced it immediately. You did not improvise repairs with scavenged materials. You did not cannibalize one vehicle to keep another running. You simply installed a new part from the endless supply. Sergeant William Chen, a mechanic whose family had immigrated from Guangdong 3 generations prior, worked near Yamamoto's station. Chen spoke basic Japanese, learned from working with technicians in occupied areas before the conflict. Over time, he and Yamamoto developed a working relationship that evolved gradually into something resembling cautious friendship. One afternoon, while Yamamoto helped organize a shipment of new tires, Chen made an offhand comment about waste. "You see those tires in the far corner?" Chen asked. "They are still usable, but they are being replaced because they are 2 years old. In 2 years, they might develop problems, so we replace them now before problems occur." Yamamoto stared at the tires in question. Each one could have kept a military vehicle running for months. His submarine base had operated boats with parts failing because replacement was impossible. They had patched, improvised, risked lives rather than cease operations. And here, tires with years of remaining life were discarded as a preventive measure. Chen seemed to sense Yamamoto's thoughts. "It seems wasteful, I know," he said, "but it is actually cheaper. A breakdown costs more than a new tire. Lost time, lost productivity, potential damage to other systems. Better to replace before failure. Cheaper, Yamamoto thought. Cheaper to throw away functional equipment than to risk its failure. What kind of economy operated on such principles? What depth of resources made this calculation sensible? That evening, Yamamoto calculated figures in his bunk. He estimated material flows, production capacity, industrial output. The numbers seemed impossible, but he checked them repeatedly. If the vehicle depot alone processed this volume of equipment, and if similar operations existed across the country, and if this was merely the military sector not counting civilian industry, then the total production capacity exceeded everything he had been taught about American capabilities. Not by a small margin, by orders of magnitude. Ensign Tanaka, in the adjacent bunk, noticed Yamamoto's scribbling. "You are thinking about the dogs again," he said with a slight smile. Yamamoto looked up. "The dogs are simply the most visible symbol. But yes, I am thinking about what they represent. We were told America was weak, decadent, soft. We were told their society was divided, fragmented, incapable of sustained effort. We were told they lacked the spiritual strength for difficult struggle. And instead," Tanaka prompted, "and instead, we find a nation that feeds its pets better than we fed our warriors. A nation that replaces functional equipment as routine maintenance. A nation that decorates halls for celebrations in the middle of operating a massive military installation. A nation that treats defeated enemies with something approaching hospitality." Tanaka was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking similar thoughts, but I'm afraid to voice them too clearly, even here. It feels like betraying something essential about who we were." Yamamoto understood completely. To acknowledge the full scope of the miscalculation was to question everything: the sacrifices, the suffering, the deaths. If America possessed resources on this scale, if their economy functioned at this level, then the entire strategic logic of the conflict collapsed. They had not been fighting a decadent power on the verge of collapse. They had been fighting an industrial superpower operating at perhaps 20% capacity, treating the conflict as one concern among many, not existential struggle requiring total national mobilization. February brought unusually cold weather to central Texas. The barracks had heating, which Yamamoto initially found surprising, then realized was simply standard. Of course they heated buildings. Why would they not? Fuel was abundant, equipment was maintained, comfort was not considered weakness. During this cold spell, Yamamoto witnessed another scene that crystallized his understanding. A young soldier, perhaps 20 years old, was walking with his dog near the administrative building. The dog, a smaller breed with long brown fur, was shivering slightly. The soldier noticed, picked up the dog, and tucked it inside his jacket for warmth. Then he continued on his way, conducting his duties one-handed while keeping the animal comfortable. Such a small gesture, utterly insignificant in strategic terms. But Yamamoto found himself profoundly moved by it. This was not about resources alone. This was about a fundamentally different relationship between individuals and systems, between power and responsibility, between strength and compassion. That evening, Captain Howard made another visit, this time with medical supplies. Several internees had developed colds during the temperature drop. Howard brought aspirin, cough medicine, throat lozenges. He also brought extra blankets. Not because anyone had requested them, simply because the temperature had dropped, and therefore more blankets were needed. Yamamoto thanked Howard formally, then asked a question he had been considering for weeks. "Captain, if I may ask, why do you treat us this way? We were your enemies. We fought against your country. Many of your countrymen were lost in the conflict, yet you bring us medicine and blankets and concern yourselves with our comfort." Howard looked at Yamamoto thoughtfully. "The war is over," he said. "You are not our enemies now. You are simply men in our custody, and we have a responsibility for your welfare. This is what our laws require, what our agreements demand, and what our values insist upon. We do not mistreat people simply because we have the power to do so. But surely you must feel anger," Yamamoto pressed. "Surely some desire for retribution." Howard considered this carefully. "Some do feel anger, yes. I would be lying if I said otherwise. But our system is not built on individual feelings. It is built on rules, procedures, protections that exist regardless of our emotions. These structures are stronger than our momentary impulses. They endure." After Howard left, Yamamoto sat thinking about that phrase. Structures stronger than impulses. This was perhaps the key insight. The abundance, the systematic maintenance, the casual feeding of dogs with quality meat, the heating of barracks, the providing of medical care, all of it emerged not from individual generosity but from embedded systems. These Americans had built a society where such treatment was simply standard procedure, so deeply ingrained that it continued even when directed toward former enemies. Spring arrived with wildflowers covering the Texas grassland beyond the fence. The camp schedule adjusted for longer daylight hours. Recreation time increased. A softball field was prepared, and internees were encouraged to form teams. Yamamoto found this surreal, but accepted it. Why not play games? Everything else about this experience defied his expectations. In April, Red Cross officials visited, conducting interviews to document conditions. Yamamoto spoke honestly about his observations. The treatment exceeded all requirements, he said. Food was abundant, housing adequate, medical care prompt. The officials seemed pleased but not surprised, as if this was simply the expected standard. One official, an older woman named Margaret Sullivan, asked Yamamoto about his plans for the future. The conflict would not last forever. Repatriation would eventually occur. What did he hope to do afterward? Yamamoto had not considered this seriously. His focus had been on immediate adaptation, on making sense of his current circumstances. But Sullivan's question forced him to look forward. "I believe I would like to study your country more carefully," he said. to understand how you have built these systems that function so effectively." Sullivan smiled. "You are not the first person to express that interest. Perhaps when circumstances permit, educational exchanges will resume. There is much we can learn from each other." Educational exchanges. The phrase seemed impossibly optimistic, almost naive, yet Sullivan spoke it with complete sincerity, as if former enemies casually learning from each other was perfectly natural. May brought news that some internees would be repatriated earlier than expected, selected based on various factors including cooperation, medical needs, family circumstances. Yamamoto was included in this initial group. He felt oddly conflicted. Part of him longed to return to his homeland, to see his family, to resume some version of normal life. But another part recognized that he would be leaving before fully understanding what he had witnessed here. The final weeks passed quickly. Processing, documentation, medical examinations, travel arrangements. Throughout it all, the same abundance continued. The dogs still received their meat. The vehicles still received new parts. The barracks remained heated or cooled as needed. The system functioned with steady, almost boring consistency. The night before departure, Ensign Tanaka approached Yamamoto during evening recreation. "We have not spoken directly about the most difficult conclusion," he said, "but I believe we both understand it now." Yamamoto nodded. "Say it plainly." Tanaka took a breath. "We could never have prevailed, not with 10 times the fighting spirit. Not with perfect strategy, not with divine intervention. The material disparity was too vast. We were fighting an enemy that could casually feed dogs with resources we could not provide our troops. The outcome was determined before the first engagement. Yamamoto had reached the same conclusion months ago, but hearing it voiced aloud carried a different weight. "Yes," he said. "The question now is what we do with that knowledge." "We return home and rebuild," Tanaka said. "We study what makes their system work. We adapt what we can while maintaining what is valuable in our own traditions. We ensure that future generations understand what we learned here." The transport ship departed from San Francisco on June 7, 1946. Yamamoto stood at the rail watching the coast recede. He thought about the dogs. Such a small detail, such a profound symbol. An entire worldview contained in that simple act of pouring meat into a metal bowl without concern for scarcity or sacrifice. The journey across the Pacific took 12 days. Yamamoto spent much of that time writing in a notebook he had been given by Captain Howard as a parting gift. He documented his observations, his calculations, his conclusions, not for any official purpose, simply to organize his thoughts and preserve what he had witnessed. Yokohama Harbor appeared misty and gray on the morning of June 19th. The city showed obvious signs of damage from air bombardment. Buildings collapsed or half-standing, infrastructure disrupted, people moving slowly, thin, worn by years of hardship. This was the Japan Yamamoto had left 13 months ago, preserved in his memory. But now he saw it through different eyes, eyes that had witnessed what genuine abundance looked like. Repatriation processing took 3 days. Questions, forms, medical checks, assignment to temporary housing. Yamamoto answered everything mechanically, his mind elsewhere. He thought about how to explain what he had learned to people who had not seen it. The raw numbers meant nothing without context. The material disparity seemed unbelievable without the daily accumulation of small observations. In the weeks that followed, Yamamoto reconnected with family, learned the fates of colleagues, began understanding the full scope of what had occurred in his absence. The conversations were difficult. People wanted to make sense of the defeat, to find explanations that preserved meaning from the sacrifices. Betrayal, poor leadership, bad fortune, all these were offered as reasons. Yamamoto listened mostly, speaking little. When people asked about his time in Texas, he kept responses brief. The treatment was correct, he would say. Conditions were adequate. Then he would change the subject. The full truth seemed too large for casual conversation, too destabilizing for a society still processing collective trauma. But to former military colleagues who pressed him privately, Yamamoto spoke more directly. "We misunderstood the nature of industrial capacity," he would say. "We assumed their comfort made them weak. Instead, their comfort emerged from strength so vast they could afford generosity without risk. They fed their dogs better than we fed our troops, not from cruelty or mockery, but because even that represented an insignificant expense within their economy. Some colleagues rejected this analysis. They insisted spiritual factors outweighed material ones, that proper fighting spirit could have compensated for resource disparities. Yamamoto no longer argued. Time and evidence would prove the point more effectively than any debate. In 1948, Yamamoto secured a position with a trading company, focused on rebuilding commercial relationships with foreign markets. The work suited his analytical nature and gave him opportunities to study American business practices more systematically. He learned about manufacturing techniques, supply chain management, quality control systems. Each discovery reinforced his earlier insights about embedded structures and systematic approaches. The trading company sent Yamamoto to San Francisco in 1951 for a commercial conference. He had not requested the assignment, but accepted it without hesitation. The city had changed significantly since his departure 5 years earlier, busier, more prosperous, continuing the growth trajectory that seemed built into American society. During free time between meetings, Yamamoto walked residential neighborhoods, parks, commercial districts. Everywhere he looked, he saw dogs, being walked by their owners, playing in yards, riding in cars. And frequently he saw feeding time, the bowls of meat, vegetables, grain, the casual abundance, the pattern unchanged. On his final day in San Francisco, Yamamoto visited a grocery store, simply to observe the available goods. The shelves stretched endlessly, stocked with varieties and quantities that would have seemed impossible in his youth. Meat cases displayed cuts in refrigerated abundance. Produce sections offered fruits and vegetables from distant regions. Everything organized, clean, constantly replenished. He thought about the young soldier in Texas who had tucked his shivering dog inside his jacket. That memory had stayed with him through everything. Not because it was dramatic or strategic, but because it was so completely unremarkable. Just a man keeping his dog warm because that is what you did. Such a small gesture, representing such profound difference in how societies functioned and what values they embedded in daily practice. Yamamoto returned to Japan with renewed understanding. His observations in Texas had been accurate, his calculations correct. But he had underestimated one dimension, the durability of systems built on abundance rather than scarcity. American prosperity was not fragile or temporary. It was structural, self-reinforcing, capable of absorbing enormous shocks and continuing to function. This was not about individual virtue or national character. This was about having built an economy and society that made casual generosity sustainable. The years that followed brought significant changes to Japan. Economic recovery accelerated. Democratic institutions developed. Trade relationships expanded. Yamamoto participated in this transformation through his commercial work, helping rebuild connections that had been severed by conflict. He watched his country adapt, learn, incorporate lessons from former enemies while maintaining distinct cultural identity. Through it all, he remembered the dogs. When colleagues discussed American society, when newspapers analyzed trade relationships, when politicians debated Reconstruction policies, Yamamoto would think about those metal bowls filled with meat. The symbol remained powerful because it captured something essential and undeniable. You could debate strategy, question decisions, argue about personalities, but you could not argue with the simple fact of what those animals were fed. The abundance was real, the disparity was vast, and the implications were clear. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.